Alright, what's going on everybody? It's Ameo. We gotta talk about Cobra Kai Season 6 Part 2. I have a lot to say and I've got some mixed feelings. And I'm worried about the direction this season is headed. Honestly, I don't think Cobra Kai will have the satisfying conclusion that people wanted. I have some hot takes, but just bear with me and I'm sure that at least most of you will agree with me. In this video, I'm going to go through a lot about this part and highlight the things that I liked and didn't like about it. Heavy spoiler warning for anyone who has not watched part 2 yet on Netflix. If you haven't, go watch it and then come back. Before we get started, please like the video if you agree with what I have to say and subscribe if you're new. It really helps support the channel and I appreciate it. It'll also help me determine if I make more of these kinds of videos in the future or not. So, we're going to start with the negatives about the characters. The worst character in this season is obviously Dimitri. We're starting with him because I have the most to say about him. He is an absolute scrub at the Sekai Taikai, which we all expected. There was also the conflict between him and Hawk about MIT, which is a conflict I could not care less about if I'm being honest. There is also a particular little story beat in part 2 that I want to go over specifically. So Dimitri and the rest of the Miyagi-Dos go out to a club in Barcelona, and while they're there, a girl approaches Dimitri and Hawk, and at first they tell each other they won't do anything because they both have girlfriends. But as soon as the girl makes a move on Dimitri, he caves and dances with her. Soon after this, Hawk gets a FaceTime call from Moon, and Hawk accidentally outs Dimitri for quote-unquote cheating on Yasmin. I put cheating in quotes because literally all he was doing was dancing with her. I will add though, it wasn't necessarily in a sexually neutral way. Regardless, Yasmin dumps Dimitri over this, and Dimitri has the audacity to blame it on Hawk and accuse him of being jealous. Another thing that happens is, Johnny and Miguel have to fly back to America for an emergency, more on that later. And while they do that, Kenny is expected to take Miguel's place in the Sekai Taikai until they get back. Kenny eventually agrees to do this and goes to Barcelona, and Dimitri immediately accuses him of being a mole for Terry Silver. We'll talk more about Terry Silver in a little bit. But Dimitri develops an actual conspiracy theory based on no real evidence that Kenny is working with Silver. There is like nothing good about Dimitri this season. You know, in the previous seasons, Dimitri was never my favorite character, but he was also always this kind of likable dork who was able to bring people together. But in season 6, he's a horrible friend, a bad boyfriend, and a liability to Miyagi-Do at the Sekai Taikai. He's one of the few characters in fiction that I've seen get ripped to shreds like this. Writers, what were you thinking on this one, man? Another character I thought was bad is Quan. The main reason I think this is because he's a big fat nothing burger. Like, he was set up to be one of the best fighters at the Sekai Taikai, which he is, but all he does other than that is use Tori to piss off Robbie. There is nearly nothing with this character, and Robbie still ends up beating him in their final match. And then, he accidentally kills himself. I'm not joking, he falls on Kreese's knife that he was holding during a fight and kills himself. Quan is definitely down there with the characters I really don't like in this show, down there with Anthony and Louie. Quan is set up and torn down in what feels like the blink of an eye. As for the character he was, he's not even likable. He's just a hot-headed douche. Another character I didn't like in part 2 is Sam, but to a slightly lesser degree because I don't think she's nearly as bad as the others I just mentioned. There is just one moment that I thought was so annoying from her. So there's this story beat where Daniel ends up getting kidnapped by some people. So it's up to Johnny to coach the kids at the tournament by himself for the time being. And you know Johnny, he's telling them to be aggressive and all that. But Sam interrupts one of his rants and tells him that if her dad were there, he would want them to have balance. And I'm just sitting there like, wait, what? Since when do you care about what your dad wants? Because if you remember in season 4, she was literally saying the same thing to Daniel, but in reverse, telling him she wanted to be more aggressive and use her own style. I swear, bro, the writers will make the characters flip on their personalities if they think it makes good conflict.
Which it doesn't.
Speaking of stupid conflict, let's start talking about it in this season because there is a lot of it. Like I said, there's the dumb little conflict with Sam and Johnny, and Hawk and Dimitri, but that's not even close to the worst conflicts in this season. Let's start with Daniel and Johnny. I cannot, for the life of me, figure out why the writers have these two going at each other's throats. Especially now, dude. Like in season 4 and especially in season 5, it felt like we were finally done with the petty fighting between the two. But nope, they're right back at it in season 6. It is so stale and uninteresting at this point. I'd much rather them argue about how to effectively work together at the tournament than listen to them bicker about Mr. Miyagi. I suppose that's as good as any segue to talk about the Mr. Miyagi plotline they're trying to do this season. It's really dumb, plain and simple. They use this plotline to take up screen time for part 1, and I think there are way better things they could have done with it. We'll get to that a little bit later. We also learned that an opponent of Mr. Miyagi died fighting him when they fought in the Sekai Taikai. And Daniel takes it really hard. Sorry for using the baby voice, but come on, man. At this point in time, we still don't know if Mr. Miyagi deliberately killed him, or if he had an accident like Quan did or what. But even if it was deliberate, for whatever reason, it clearly made Mr. Miyagi so ashamed that he hated fighting in tournaments from that point on. They try to make it seem like this completely changes everything Daniel knew about Mr. Miyagi, as if they didn't spend years together as basically father and son, with Mr. Miyagi having turned over a new leaf and leaving that violent life behind him for the better. And now that Daniel knows, he's wondering why Mr. Miyagi never told him, and I can tell you without even really knowing, it's because he's ashamed. And Daniel was very ambitious and had a hot head as a kid. Remember, in Karate Kid 3, Daniel was set on joining the All Valley tournament to defend his title. That is, until Mr. Miyagi talked him out of it. Maybe Mr. Miyagi didn't tell Daniel about the Sekai Taikai because he didn't want his ambitious self to try to follow in his footsteps and join the tournament to kill or even be killed. It's really not a hard concept to grasp. We also need to talk about the Iron Dragons. Who are these guys? I don't mean that rhetorically, like actually, who are they and why weren't they introduced sooner? See, this is something I would have rather seen built up in part 1 instead of the Miyagi plotline. Because if you were only watching the show and not paying any attention to social media or the leaks, you'd have no idea who they were until they were introduced in part 2. And they would suddenly be introduced as the new big bad dojo, since they make the Korean Cobra Kai students look like fools in their first fight. It just really doesn't work here for me. How are you not going to give them any kind of setup in part 1, but expect everyone to buy that they're the dojo to beat a quarter of the way through the last season of the entire show? It just feels so forced. Speaking of the Iron Dragons, let's talk about Terry Silver. Yes, he's back this season, and I don't know how I feel about it, to be honest. Because it feels like he doesn't play much of a role other than it's the last season, so he should be there. Silver is there to sponsor the Iron Dragons and give them information about Mr. Miyagi to Daniel. And he arranged Daniel's kidnapping that I mentioned earlier, and that's it. I kid you not, those are the only things he does that make you feel like he's a big player in the story. And you might think that what I just mentioned is actually a lot, but the point I'm making is, it feels like all of that still could have happened without Silver. Like, the Iron Dragons could have come out by themselves, without having Silver as a sponsor. Daniel's kidnapping could have been arranged by Kreese and it still would have worked from a narrative perspective. And the Mr. Miyagi information could have been discovered some other way. Because seriously, how did Silver know that Daniel was looking into that? Like, I'm trying to go off my memory, and there was no indication that I can remember that Silver would have known that information. Something I actually did like about this part is the dynamics between Johnny, Robbie, and Miguel. Robbie and Miguel actually have a good and interesting conflict in this part of the season. For the first few episodes fighting in the tournament, Robbie is getting cooked in nearly every fight he's in, because he's distracted about Tori being in Cobra Kai. At the same time, Miguel is cooking everyone else in the fights he's in. Basically, Miguel is carrying the entire Miyagi-Do team on his back, and it's not even exaggeration. Miguel calls Robbie out and says he rightfully deserves to be captain, and Robbie doesn't really have a counter to that argument. Suddenly, Miguel and Johnny are called by Miguel's grandma back home, telling them that there is an emergency regarding Carmen's pregnancy. So Miguel and Johnny find themselves racing back home to get with her and be with her, but the plane ride doesn't go very smooth. Because while Miguel was killing it at the tournament, Johnny was not giving him any credit for it. And then Johnny tried to give all the students a tough love pep talk, which no one wanted to hear. Johnny and Miguel do finally reconcile though, with Johnny finally referring to Miguel as his son. And they get back to find out that Carmen and the baby are alive and safe. Carmen then tells them to go back to the Sekai Taikai and also makes them promise that they'll win. Once they do get back, Miguel and Robbie reconcile, with Miguel helping Robbie snap out of it and regain his focus toward the tournament. Robbie then goes on to lead Miyagi-Do to beat Quan and Cobra Kai as a whole. This is a great conflict for two main reasons. Number one, it has a satisfying conclusion. Number two, it makes sense and doesn't feel forced. For the whole show, people have debated who was the actual better fighter between Robbie and Miguel. And now they both have a chance to prove it on a stage in front of the world that could most likely change their entire life. It makes total sense that they would be at each other's throats. Now, it's time to talk about the finale. This finale is definitely not what I expected. We'll just go through the story beats and then I'll give my thoughts, as well as a rather arrogant alternate script and opinion of why/how I could have written it better. So like I said, Robbie is eventually able to get his head on straight and help knock Cobra Kai out of the tournament. But it's discovered that the students on the Russian team at the tournament were using performance-enhancing drugs. They're kicked out of the tournament for this, and since Cobra Kai has the next highest score after them, they are let back into the tournament. They then move on to the semifinal rounds, where it's Quan versus another team's captain, and Robbie versus Axel, who was the male captain on the Iron Dragons. Robbie is in the middle of this fight getting absolutely cooked by Axel because he's a very skilled and strong fighter. They also set up Sam and Tori for a match, but it never happens. And that's because the disgruntled Russian sensei returns to the Sekai Taikai arena with his students and incites an all-out karate war between all of the dojos. At this point, everyone, teachers and students, are fighting. Kreese goes after Silver to fight, Johnny and Daniel face off against the Iron Dragon sensei, Robbie and Miguel fight Axel and both of them get slammed, Sam and Tori face off against Zara, the Iron Dragon's female captain. It is just a big fat mess. But then Quan and Axel begin to fight, and Quan finds Kreese's knife, which he tries to use to kill Axel. Instead, Axel defends himself well and makes Quan fall on the knife, accidentally killing himself, like I said before. Part 2 ends with everyone looking in horror at what just happened, and the announcer screaming, "Cut the feed," towards the camera. Okay, seriously, what is this finale? And I ask that because I seriously don't know how they end the season after this. There is no shot that they continue the tournament after this. I mean, right? No, they definitely will, and I'm waiting to discover what kind of rinky-dink answer they come up with as for why the tournament needs to continue at this point. Because I may not like Quan, but it seems like deaths are rare in this tournament and haven't happened for a long time. And for this to happen so suddenly, especially after an all-out riot at this organized event ending with the death of a foreigner, I can't think of a good reason as to why the tournament continues. Also, this was what was supposed to make me hyped to watch part 3?
I never even liked Quan in the first place, bro.
And it's for the reasons I stated before. Like, what kind of a cliffhanger is this? Quan was introduced and died in the same season. He was given so little character, it's laughable. And the writers think that killing him off will make me pumped for part 3. It actually makes my head hurt. Now, I'm gonna be a little arrogant right now and say I could have written this better. I would have made it so Miguel and Johnny going home takes a few episodes. Like, in the actual season, they go and come back in the same episode. But in my version, it would take a little bit. Like, it should have taken until the end of part 2, if I'm being honest. It could have been that Carmen was in critical condition and they had to stay there to make sure she was alright. Meanwhile, at the Sekai Taikai, Kenny showing up would be the game changer for Robbie. Kenny would help Robbie get refocused enough to defeat Quan in their fight, so that arc has a satisfying conclusion. You could then make it where all the same teams advance in the tournament, but not to the semifinals yet for the sake of leaving room for part 3. The Russian team can still get kicked out for the usage of drugs, and Cobra Kai can be let back in. Only this time, the Russian team doesn't go crazy and attack the tournament. Instead, you could have Robbie face off against Axel normally. But Axel, being pressured by his abusive sensei and feeling frustrated that Sam already has a boyfriend,
Yes, Axel has a crush on Sam.
lashes out at Robbie, and it's brutal. So brutal that you can see Robbie doesn't stand a chance. You could even make it so Axel cheap shots Robbie by breaking one of his limbs, putting him out of commission for the rest of the tournament. The tournament organizers are obviously furious about this and threaten to kick the Iron Dragons out of the Sekai Taikai for this. The sensei for the Iron Dragons makes the point that Robbie was getting beat badly before the cheap shot, so even if it didn't happen, Axel would have won. You could also make him play the accidents happen card. Ultimately, the tournament organizers agreed to let the Iron Dragons continue competing, but one more cheap shot like that and they're out. Additionally, they let Miyagi-Do choose a new male captain, since Robbie's out. The part would end back in America, with Carmen fully recovering and telling Johnny and Miguel the same thing, to go and win. Daniel relays the news to Johnny about Robbie, and Miguel is promoted to team captain with a new motivation to win the tournament. But he now realizes he has to make it through Cobra Kai and Kreese again, and then the Iron Dragons with Terry Silver and Axel. And that's how I would have ended it. Doesn't that seem like a much better cliffhanger? I feel like it's much more compelling, and you've still got a lot to work with in part 3. You've got Tori and Sam's final fight. You've got the fight between Tori and Zara. And you've got Miguel's fights against Quan and Axel. I just really feel like it should be Miguel to win the Sekai Taikai. For one, the series started with him and I think it should end with him. And after all he's been through the whole series, becoming paralyzed, having arguments with Johnny about a lot of things, the heartbreak and conflict he's gone through, and to be honest, he doesn't have a lot to show for it. I mean, he didn't even finish the last All Valley tournament because of his conflict with Johnny. Like, I know this alternate script I just pitched isn't perfect, but still, that is the direction I wish they had leaned towards instead of the weird direction I know they're heading. Anyway, that about does it for this rant. If you managed to watch all the way to the end, give yourself a pat on the back. Especially if you disagreed with me but watched it anyway. I hope you all understand that I made this video because I care about Cobra Kai, and right now, the season is feeling like it has a few missed opportunities and bad narrative decisions. At the end of the day, you guys are awesome. I'm just going to remind you that if you did like or agree with what I had to say, leave a like on the video and subscribe. It'll give me incentive to make more video essays like this in the future. Also, we're nearly at 700 subs, so if we could get there, that would be awesome. Anyway, thanks everybody for listening, and I will see all of you in the next video. Later, everyone.